Growing up in Gloucester, England, the West children were kept in line with a specific threat. If they misbehaved, they were told they would end up under the patio in the back garden, right next to their missing older sister, Heather. To the outside world, this sounded like dark, sarcastic British humor. For years, that comment was brushed off as a morbid family joke. But in 1994, it reached the ears of local police. They secured a search warrant for the property, and in a matter of days, the illusion of a normal, working-class family completely evaporated. When we look at this simulated ground-penetrating radar scan of the property, we can see exactly what investigators found. The equipment detected dense, irregular anomalies clustered directly beneath the concrete. When excavation teams broke through the surface, they immediately uncovered jumbled human remains. What started as a search for one missing teenager rapidly escalated into the exposure of an entire subterranean graveyard. Investigators eventually realized they were dealing with a husband and wife team, Fred and Rose West, who had successfully hidden at least 12 murders over an unbroken 20-year span. They preyed almost exclusively on vulnerable women. Their victims included young hitchhikers, college students, short-term lodgers renting rooms in their house, and most chillingly, their own children, including 8-year-old Charmaine and 16-year-old Heather. Serial killers operating independently are rare enough, but a domestic slaughterhouse actively managed by a married couple and hidden in plain sight for 2 decades requires a highly specific, interlocking pathology to survive. The true scale of their violence became possible in 1972. That year, the couple purchased a Victorian terrace home at 25 Cromwell Street. Outwardly, it looked perfectly unremarkable, but Fred's background as a builder allowed him to modify the property into a secure physical domain. The Wests used the home's sheer size as a trap. Converting the upper floors into bedsits, they advertised cheap lodgings to runaways and young women. They convinced victims to enter a highly controlled environment where the couple held the keys. This 3D cross-section illustrates how they disposed of bodies. Fred excavated narrow, vertical shafts into the foundation, remains decomposed in the damp clay. He routinely removed kneecaps and finger joints as trophies. Placing the home's weight over the victims satisfied a craving for absolute containment. The property at 25 Cromwell Street served a dual purpose. It was a disposal site, but it also functioned as an architectural manifestation of their need for total, sadistic dominion over the people they captured. To understand how 2 people could operate like this, we must look at how they were formed. Fred West grew up in deep rural poverty. He was raised by a father maintaining an attitude of extreme sexual entitlement. Fred was taught early on that physical boundaries simply did not exist. Then, at age 17, Fred crashed his motorcycle. He spent a week in a coma and required a metal plate in his skull. The severe trauma to his frontal lobe, the brain's impulse control center, permanently stripped away his ability to regulate his own behavior or process social consequences. Rose Letts emerged from a parallel nightmare. Her father was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and routinely subjected his family to extreme violence. By the time Rose was 13, this toxic environment had already triggered severe predatory behavior toward her younger brothers. We can model their dynamic as folie à deux, a shared psychotic disorder. Fred carried a chaotic, impulsive, predatory drive. Rose possessed a need for sadistic organizational dominance. In this union, their separate pathologies merged into a single self-sustaining operation. Together, they built an insular reality. Because both had been severely abused by their own fathers, they adopted the terrifying belief that people, especially their children and lodgers, were literal property, possessing an absolute right to violate anyone under their roof. Fred lacked the discipline to hide bodies for 20 years. Rose lacked the physical strength to subdue dozens of victims. But their marriage successfully weaponized their individual brokenness into a perfect, cooperative killing machine. The tragedy of the West case is how often authorities had the chance to intervene. Between 1972 and 1992, the violently abused West children were admitted to local hospital emergency rooms 31 separate times. Each injury was logged as an accident. Social services were never called to investigate the home. The silence finally cracked in 1992. Fred had repeatedly assaulted his 13-year-old daughter, Louise. Breaking years of conditioning, Louise bravely disclosed the abuse to a friend, whose mother immediately tipped off the police. That single act of courage unraveled the entire operation. Once arrested in 1994, the couple's strategies diverged. Fred produced dozens of hours of shifting, manipulative confessions, constantly changing his story to taunt detectives. Rose, meanwhile, maintained a stoic posture of absolute denial, claiming she was a naive housewife who knew nothing about the bodies buried beneath her. Fred made sure he'd never answer for those crimes. On January 1, 1995, while on remand at HM Prison Birmingham, he took his own life. It was a final assertion of control, cheating the justice system and denying the victims' families a trial. Rose West went to trial alone and was convicted of 10 murders, receiving a life sentence. But 30 years later, the case remains an open wound. Police still suspect Fred is linked to several missing girls, including 15-year-old Mary Bastholm, and questions linger over whether Rose acted completely alone in the 1971 murder of 8-year-old Charmaine while Fred was in prison. The horror of Cromwell Street was built on untreated neurological trauma and generations of inherited abuse, but it survived for 20 years because of a society too willing to look away. When institutions bloody on